Hello, welcome to lesson 12.1, Processing Statements, from the University of Idaho's CS 112 dual credit class, Computational Thinking. Today we're going to be talking about processing, and we're going to be covering some aspects of processing that you haven't used quite yet. So far you should have already learned some of the syntax for processing through prior lessons. If you have not seen those lessons yet, you may want to go back and review those just so you kind of have a basis and understanding for how we're going forward with this. We're going to be reviewing some of those statements that we have learned. We will be creating a program that follows our mouse around the screen and kind of slowly starts to disappear behind it. You can actually choose something similar to this in most Windows and even Mac-based products uh, that will allow your um, mouse to kind of leave a fading trail of mice behind it. Uh, we're going to be creating something similar, but in processing. Processing has several function formats that uh, work in it. The main ones that you're going to be working with, especially in this course, is this void system that's kind of set up here on the screen, where we say void and then we can give it a name, and then we can provide a bunch of statements for that function. And what that does is it's simply a function or a parameter, maybe you're a little more familiar with, that is going to run that specific set anytime we kind of tell it to. There's two fundamental ones, a void setup and a void draw. Setup runs once and draw runs continuously, and so it continues to redraw the canvas. As it kind of notes down here, void is used for setup and draw because they perform a function but don't return a value. Later on we will talk about different functions that provide a value that kind of come out of when it occurs. In prior lessons, you should have already kind of noticed that we can start doing commenting. Comments can work with just a single slash. However, most of the time and whenever I'm doing these, you're going to see that I'm going to use these double slashes for the most part, especially at the end of, let's say, a line that I'm commenting on. You can see an example there of where we have a slash slash, then write a comment here. You can also use another thing. This is extremely helpful whenever trying to debug, is a multi-line comment. You can open and close them using the star or the slash asterisk and then a asterisk star or asterisk slash. Sorry. Again, this is for a multi-line comment. It will start it, and until you tell it, until it sees that star slash symbol, it's going to keep treating it as a comment. Like I said, this is extremely helpful for whenever you're trying to problem solve. Maybe you have a function that's just not kind of working out right, and you can kind of you can use this to block out a large thing of stuff that you added in that you didn't kind of test as you were going, and you can kind of see, okay, is my problem with something prior to this, or is it in the actual thing right here? We have a couple things that you need to be able to use. And what we do here is we can actually set the size, and the size is given in the number of pixels, and this needs to be a whole number. You can't really have half a pixel. A pixel, if you're not aware, a is one of those is a little tiny dot that actually occurs on your screen. We call those pixels. You may have heard this before of like, oh, my monitor has, and then they say some outrageous number of pixels. So for this example, we're going to be making a screen that's 200 pixels wide and a height of 300 pixels. And we can kind of see how that looks like in processing. Um, the size is based off of, we go X, so we go the width or the X kind of first, if you like to kind of think of this in terms of graphing this like on a ordered pair, or like in your kind of maybe like an algebra class. So we have our X value, which is 200, and then we have our size, or sorry, not our size, our Y value. This Y value actually starts from the top and works our way down. which is a little opposite of what you kind of think of whenever you think of graphing in, let's say, a math class, in that you normally have 0 as the bottom and you work your way up. We actually go the opposite way in processing, where we start at 0 and we go down, and that's actually what we consider the positive direction. And it is really important to kind of keep that in mind as we're going through this, so that we start at the top and work our way down. I didn't mention this, but on size for your x value, we start on our left and work to our right. That's a little more um, typical whenever you're thinking of graphing something. Um, Once we kind of set the size, we can start working with that size. It stores, processing natively stores these as width and height. And it's really handy in that you can start talking about that width and that height, and you can keep using it over and over and over again. Those are some built-in variables. Uh, you sh you may have encountered these before in NetLogo in prior lessons. Um, However, like I said, these are built in, and so if you just put width, it should appear as something. Um, this is talking about creating an ellipse. An ellipse is basically a circle. However, it doesn't necessarily have to be a circle. It can kind of be more oval-esque, if you will. Um, you actually tell it the location, and then you tell it the kind of the width again, and then our height again. As you can see, these aren't perfect values. If they were perfectly the same, it would be a circle, but because they're not, it's going to be a little bit more tall than it is wide. Next thing that we want to talk about is color mode. Color mode is extremely handy, and it's actually important to kind of know what your color mode is. Jumping back and forth, it can happen, especially when you start talking about different colors and stuff like that. We have a couple different color modes that we can use. The standard use, and for those of you that maybe know kind of a little more like techie type stuff, is going to be RGB. RGB stands for red, green, blue. And this range goes from 0 to 255, which some people think is kind of weird. Um, it's just kind of how it works. That's kind of the best explanation I can give you right now without going into like a super technical, like, well, the reason that it's 255 is this. Uh, just kind of say, okay, yeah, that's what we can do, is from 0 to 255, 0 being the least, 255 being the most. Declaring the color mode is actually pretty handy. The reason why is sometimes it can be changed, and suddenly your program starts working in a different method, and we're going to talk about the different method here in a second. So in this example, so we have RGB. RGB, like I said, is red, green, blue. The first aspect that we tell it is how much red to put it, uh, how much green to put, and how much blue to put. And you also have to keep in mind that what we're talking about now is we're talking about light. We're no longer talking about your typical pigments. If you're talking like a kind of more art style, we're actually kind of going in a different direction with this. Um, RGB in terms of light are the three primary colors. Again, this is when we're talking about light. It's not necessarily true whenever we're talking about something like your artist, whenever you're working with pigments, such as in maybe an art class or working with paint. So 000, for example, would give us black. There's no light being given out. Whereas 255, 255, 255 is going to be white. It's all of the color being given at one time. Like I said, we have another type. Another type is called HSB, hue, saturation, brightness. And what's kind of nice about HSB is that it actually uses a range from 0 to 360. So you kind of can imagine this is like a color wheel. Um, and then that's just figuring out the hue. From there, we figure out the saturation and the brightness, and both of those are a little bit self-explanatory in the idea that saturation is kind of like how much of it there is, and then the brightness is how much it's kind of popping. That's what I like to think of it as. This one's a little different. Like I kind of said, whenever you're talking RGB, RGB goes from 0 to 255 for the three different ones. HSB is a little bit different. HSB goes from 0 to 360. That's how many degrees there are in a circle. And then the saturation and the brightness are all from 0 to 100. We can set a background, or we can make kind of everything look to be one thing. So whenever we start the setup, we can actually tell the background how it should look, what color it should be. In this case, whenever we're looking at this background command that we have right here, we have background 25500. You can imagine, so it says background, and we're in RGB mode. By default, we start in RGB. It may be that you change it to HSB at some point, or yeah, HSB at some point in time, and that's fine, but it's important to remember what setting you're in. I personally like to add in the color mode over and over again just to make sure, yes, I'm in RGB mode. Um, I probably said it before, um, but in the end, I don't trust the consumer or the person using my program to use it effectively and correctly. Um, at some point in time, the computer's going to crash or the user's going to exit unexpectedly. And if it's stuck in that HSB mode, now all of a sudden your entire program doesn't work. So especially like at the beginning of a program, I like to start off, okay, this is the color mode that I'm in, even if it's redundant of saying like, okay, if we're going to be in RGB and the program goes, well, we're already in RGB. You're saying, you know what, we're going to make sure we're in RGB. There's a couple other things that we need to know before we start really drawing things, and that's really what the power of processing is being able to draw. So we have things like stroke. Stroke is, as you will, a kind of a border around an object. So if we draw an object, we have a stroke around it. You can kind of set this as the outline. If you think of maybe back whenever you were a little kid, you had the coloring books, and you stay inside the lines, and these are the lines. This is the stroke, and you can set that to be a special color. You can make it black, you can make it white, you can make it pretty much whatever you want. You should know that that will show. As long as it's the topmost layer, it will show through. Um, the next thing that we have kind of goes along with that is the fill. Uh, Red, green, blue, and then the transparency. We are able to set a fill color. This is how much there is inside, or what color is inside of the shape that we draw. You can imagine this almost if you ever use Microsoft Paint, of that little paint bucket. You fill the inside, and that's what it looks like. No stroke is a command in and of itself, and so that's why you see it having these two brackets right after each other. We don't give it anything in there, but we're saying, hey, this is a function. This is something that you need to know. We're not calling this some kind of random variable, which you should never name a variable no stroke just because it's so similar. Uh, and this tells us that we have no border color. No fill kind of makes sense. We have no fill color, which is different than saying giving this 0, 0, 0. And the reason that that's different is giving this 0, 0, 0 is going to make it white. It's not going to make it transparent unless you change this transparency. It's going to make it white, so it's going to kind of be overlaying a white. You can almost imagine this of being like if you're drawing like a person's face or something like that, where you have the face itself is tan, um, maybe you have something underneath where it's a different color. Maybe like the hair goes into the eyes, but you want the eyes over the top. Um, and then on top of that, you want a white eyeball. You're going to need to specifically tell it to be white. And so this no fill and fill are two different ideas. No fill, you don't have to worry about this whole all of this stuff. It just says, hey, we don't want this to have any color. Stroke weight tells us how thick of a line we want our border to be. The default weight size is 1, which is 1 pixel. Those are weighted in pixels. Um, and you can kind of set this to be whatever you want. There's a certain point where it's like, okay, why not just call that a fill, make it a square in of itself. Um, Down here we talk about it a little bit, that this transparency, which I referred to up here, goes from 0 to 255. Again, kind of weird. 0 being the most transparent, it's kind of like not even there, to 255, which is completely there. You can again imagine this as being like how high are we turning on those lights? How long high are we turning on that ability for it to show through? You can also always go and check what a certain color is using the tools drop down menu and selecting a color from the color selector. Additionally, we have different shapes that we can do and different things that can be drawn. Again, like I said, processing is used a lot for drawing. It's used a very heavy artist-based program. Um, and so with that, there's a few basic shapes that we need to be able to draw. The first one is a point. This one kind of makes sense if you want to put a point somewhere. You put point and you give it an x coordinate and a y coordinate. X core and y core by default, anytime we have those, we're going to imagine being x coordinate and y coordinate, unless I tell you otherwise. The next thing that we can draw is a line. In this, you can see that we give the x1 and y1 coordinate, and then the x2 and y2 coordinate. And what this does is this draws it from one coordinate, or from one place to the other. Now, one thing to remember is that y value is actually upside down from what you're or from what you kind of start or are used to whenever we're talking about a Cartesian coordinate plane. So we start at the top and work our way down. A rectangle. There's actually a couple ways of using a rectangle. We'll talk about those in a little bit. Uh, but by default, what it is we give it the x and the y coordinate of the upper left-hand corner. So we tell it where to start drawing. And remember, we kind of work from our top left, and I'm making movements up here, and you can't see that. We start in the top left, and we draw from there. And so that's what we continue doing with that rectangle is we tell it the top left location, and then we tell it, okay, this is how wide and this is how high. Again, remembering as our height actually goes down and not up. Like I said, there's a couple other ones, and we'll talk about those here in a minute, actually a little while. Ellipse is a little bit different. Like I kind of mentioned before, ellipses is kind of how you draw a circle, or how you would draw a circle. However, it does not have to be a circle. You can make that kind of egg shape, or you can kind of make it that oval. Again, we have the x and y coordinate, but an ellipse is different. It starts in the center. It tells you kind of the center of where we're going. You can almost kind of imagine this of being, if you're using a compass, how you kind of draw around the center of that coordinate. That's what this ellipse is doing. A triangle is a little more complex in that what we actually wind up doing is it expects us to tell it the three vertices, the three places to draw to. So we do the x1 and y1 coordinates, the x2, y2, the x3, y3. So that's telling us the three different vertexes that we want to draw it from. A quad draws a quadrilateral, which is different from a rectangle. Rectangles can be squares, rectangles can be rectangles. A quadrilateral does not have to follow the rules of a rectangle. And so we tell it the different locations. This might be good if you're trying to draw something that's maybe not a rectangle or a square, and you're just trying to okay, how do we make this look good? So what we're going to do is we're going to try some code. Let's see if I can pull it up for you. The version of processing that I'm using is 3.5.4. In case something doesn't quite look quite right, you can kind of see oh, maybe the format or the style changed. Let's see if I can't make this a little bigger for you guys. Let's see. No, okay. I'll see if I can do that in later videos. So let's go ahead and try a code. And so whenever we write this code, we're going to go, okay, size 200, comma, 200, parenthesis. Semicolons are really important whenever we're talking about trying to make something run. It tells us this is the end of the command. Again, slash slash is how we start commenting. And so we're making the window, I like to call them windows, 200 wide, 200 tall. Now, eventually you're going to get to the point of where you don't need to comment of how big is the window. You're going to start be able to figure that kind of on your own. But whenever you're first starting off, it doesn't hurt to do something like that. The next term that we can do is background, 255. Now the nice thing with background is there is an ability to just tell it one number, and it will work off of that. It's not as dynamic as being able to do RGB, and we definitely could go and put RGB numbers in there. But it's kind of nice whenever we're talking just okay, we want a single color, we're just going to put 255, and that means just it's going to be white. Next thing that we're going to put is no stroke. And no stroke is going to make it so that there's no border. this background, and this background means the background is going to be white. Again, that means we have all the light coming in. We're not holding anything back. Fill is what the inside of our object is going to be. And it's important to know that we have to tell it before we draw it of what it wants to look like. And everything after this point until we change the fill is going to have the same color. So you can see down here that it says what it expects. So in this case, it expects there to be parameters like an integer again being a whole number. In this case, we're going to give it some values. We're going to say 246, 255, 5, and 160. Now, those might seem like random numbers, and what this is actually going to be is this is going to be the color yellow. And it's going to be a little bit see-through. You can tell that because of this 160 right here. If you're like, I just don't know, then I don't know the RGB or even the HSB of the certain thing that I'm looking for, you can always go to Tools and click on Color Selector. And you can kind of see here it actually gives us the two different versions that we talked about. This is actually a third version that's available to be used. I'm not a huge fan of it because I just really don't get it very well. But down here I can see, hey look, there's yellow. And right now it's set to be white, but if I said, hey, I want to be yellow, I can go over here and I can see, oh, that's the color I'm looking at. And I can actually even type it in. And if I look at this 246, I can say, okay, I want this to be 246. And then I want this to be 255. I'll be able to actually tell you what the exact color looks like, and 5. And that's what the color yellow that we're going to make is. There's an ability to copy, and it copies this specific function right here, and you can use that in there. Again, I'm not a huge fan of it, mainly because I personally am like, I don't really get it. I'm sure someone's like, oh, you just do this, this, and this. But for now, we're just going to stick with this RGB. Okay. Now we're going to make an ellipse. Again, ellipse is similar to that of a circle, and so we're going to make a circle that's centered on 47. That's the X, 36 being the Y, and we're going to make it 64 by 64. And what this is going to make it is going to make a circle. So this is going to be a circle at the location 47, 36. And again, as long as these two numbers are the same, we're going to have a circle. Otherwise, we'd have an actual ellipse. Now, if I were to draw another ellipse at 90, 47, 64, 64, this is going to make another circle, and this circle is also going to be yellow. Well, that's kind of boring, so I'm going to add in a new color, and I'm going to tell it to change the color. Again, this might seem a little random, but let's make this one green. Now, the nice thing about green, blue, and red is they're really easy to program in. You can be like, all right, it's going to be this, comma, let's make this the same opaqueness, so, or transparency, so we'll make it 160. And so this is going to make it green. Remember RGB, so 0 red, all green, no blue. It's going to make it green. An ellipse. So this is going to be a circle. Oops, circle at the location 90, 47. Now, some of you may have noticed that I didn't space these out. You technically don't have to. However, good practice is to space them out. A lot of times it makes it easier to find. You also might be asking, well, why are you saying what the location is in the comments? Because a lot of times whenever I'm looking at this, if I just look at just this and nothing else, I'm going to be confused. I'm not going to really know what location it is. I might come back in later and say like the general area that it's located in case I started having like multiple greens, multiple yellows. Okay. Let's make another one, and let's make this one blue. So if I do fill, I want to make this blue, so red is 0, no zero, or no red, no green, and all blue. Some of you might be getting where I'm going with this one. What we're going to get here is it's going to make it blue. ellipse, we're going to have at 57, 79, 64, make it a circle, 64, put a space in there just to make it look nice. And again, I'm going to say this is the circle at the location 57, 79. And I think it's really important to say what the shape is that we're trying to make, or whatever it is that's supposed to be drawn at the time. That way we can kind of compare it and make sure it looks good. So if we hit the run button, we're going to make a circle. Or not circle, we're going to make a pair of circles. And these are going to kind of overlap. And some of you may be like, oh wait, I know what that is. These are supposed to be the three primary colors. So what we see here, and actually I guess this isn't primary because this would be red if we did. So what we can see is that they can actually overlap. We can actually see that yellow underneath the green, and we can see it underneath the blue. And actually that's how it's drawn, is it draws the yellow, then it draws the green, then it draws the blue. Why? Because we first drew the yellow, we drew the green, and then we drew the blue. Okay, let's change this up a little bit. Alright, that's fun enough. Let's change this background to 0. What is that going to do? It's going to set this from white to black. And I like to change my comments as I go. That way I don't think something's happening that's not actually supposed to happen. And so what we can see here is we suddenly get a little bit lighter almost in this yellow. And it's really that perspective thing. You may have seen it where oh, these two shades of gray are different. Oh, put your finger over it. They're actually the same. Same idea. So these were actually all equally shaded, but in the background instead we now have black. You can go in and you can try different colors. Let's say I wanted to make this, instead of yellow, I wanted to make it red. 255, 0, 0. Again, changing my comments as I go. That way I don't think that that's still supposed to be the yellow, and I'm freaking out going, why is it making yellow? Okay, there we go. Let's change the green to yellowish. Was it something like that? Yeah, there we go. Nice little yellow. So go ahead, try playing around with that a little bit. Obviously, I'll wait if you decide to pause this. We're going to move on as far as my recording goes. The other thing that we're going to work on is we're going to work with the mouse. So you can actually have a couple there's a couple things that exist already for the mouse. And the kind of the big one, especially when you're talking about trying to track where the mouse is we can find the location using mouse X and mouse Y. We can also detect if a button has been pressed, specifically the left button. There's a way of checking the right button. It's a little more technical just because the right button, right mouse button typically opens up different things. And it's not just simply kind of a check. This is a Boolean statement. A Boolean statement, again, is it's either a true or false, the button is pressed, or it isn't. So we're going to make a new code. And so this was fun and all, but let's change this. And actually we're going to leave this, actually we'll put the size into something else. So what we're going to do is we're going to use that term that I talked about at the beginning. There's void setup. And this uses the curly brackets. NetLogo used the kind of the square brackets. Processing uses curly brackets. It's important to have this set right here. This set of parentheses is extremely helpful, and later on we'll actually start using them. But what this says is there's nothing that's going into this. It's just happening. Just let setup happen. There's nothing that we need to pull in from anywhere else. So what we're going to do is we're going to set a size. We're going to set the size to be the same. Extra space in there. Not really a big deal that I had that extra space, but I just kind of don't like it. Again, I'm going to say the window is 200, 200. And there's actually also a way to make it go full screen, but we won't talk about that for a while. The next thing that we have is we'll set the background. And the background, let's set it to be 0. So remember, this means no light, so this is going to be black background. If I can spell background, that'd be nice. There we go. And I like to give a space afterwards, that way I don't get it all mixed together. And let's say no stroke. And so what this does is this starts everything off saying we're not going to have a stroke for anything. Additionally, in setup, a lot of times what I like to do is I like to put in color mode, and I say RGB. And following that, you can actually tell it a list of like the numbers that it can go up to. And so I could say RGB 100, 100, 100, and it only allow it to go up to 100 before resetting. Not super important that you know that, but it is good to know. So no stroke, no outline, color mode, sets the color to be RGB based. The next thing that we said, that I said that is kind of typical that you need, is a void draw. This void draw, you'll kind of see it's yelling at me. It's saying, hey, you're missing a right curly bracket. Okay, I'll give you the curly bracket. That way that one's kind of all happy. And so let's draw something. Let's draw a red circle. So we have to set a fill. So we're going to say, okay, I want it to be red. So all red, no green, no blue. Let's draw an ellipse because we want it to be a circle, right? Now, like I said before, there's this cool thing that has built in that these two numbers, the width and the height, have been automatically saved by processing. It knows how big the screen is, which is kind of important that it knows how big it is. But what we can do is we can say the width. See how it popped up in this like kind of purpley? That means, hey, we already know that this variable is called width, divided by 2. Now there's kind of two methods of thought. You could go width and width because they're the same, or you can do width and height. I like to do height simply because if somehow the height gets changed, I still want it to be where we're telling this to be. And like I said, we want this to be a circle, so 50 and 50. Close that up. So an ellipse with the x location being the width divided by 2, the y location being the height divided by 2, 50, 50. So 50 wide, 50 tall. And what this is going to draw is this is going to draw, and we can actually just click the little button that says run. It's going to draw a red dot in the middle of our screen, and really the middle of the sketch. So I can move this sketch around. It's no longer in the middle. So it's going to draw a red dot whose center is based in the middle of the screen. Okay, that's fun enough, but let's change it up a little bit. Why? Because we like variety is the spice of life. So right now I'm going to say this is a red, color red, and circle in the middle. So let's make some changes. So what we can do, let's have a little bit of fun with this. So kind of our end goal, like I said, is to make it so that then it follows our mouse around. All right. So whenever we do that, we say, okay, let's use these two commands. So we can use mouse X, and that finds the mouse X location and says it's that, and then the mouse Y. All right, circle following the mouse. Let's change this a little bit. Let's make the background to 55. So now instead of being black, this is actually going to be white. Oh, actually, no. Let's keep that the same. I want that. Instead of no stroke, let's make it a stroke. Let's make it a stroke of 255. I think that's going to look a little nicer. We'll actually be able to see the things that are happening. So if we click play, oh, I didn't change that background back to 0. Let that be 0. Here we go. All right. So now we have this red dot following our mouse around. And there's kind of one issue though that we're seeing. We're seeing is that I'm not actually like I'm keeping these the lines from all the different circles on there, and you kind of can actually see how quick it's um, like actually drawing these, because whenever I'm moving my mouse fast, you can kind of see the dots more than if I move my mouse slow, just like that. Those of you maybe that have played solitaire might recognize, the whole like doop, 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 doop. So you can now make a solitaire game with this. Just kidding. Not everything is covered right here. Okay. So additional things that we can do. Let's go to, let's make it so that we can start drawing and actually kind of making it so they seem to disappear. The way that we seem to make them disappear is we can actually kind of do this fill and 0, 50. I didn't really talk about this. The reason why is it can get really confusing if you're like, okay, fill has RGB, or you can just give it one number. Now I'm actually giving it 2. And what I'm doing with this 2 is I'm still kind of following the same idea of giving it one number, but following that one number, I give it how transparent to be. So in this case, it's 0. This is black with some transparency, so we're able to kind of see through it. Now what we're going to do is we're going to draw a rectangle that starts at 0, 0. And we want it to fill the entire stage. And the reason that we want this to fill the entire stage is that way it's covering everything. And so what I like to do here is I like to say, okay, I'm going to do the width, I'm going to do the height. So this is black with some transparency. And this draws a rectangle over everything. Let's see what that does. So I push the play button. And okay, we have this. And what you can see is that we start going over the top of everything. And so what's happening here is as I'm moving my mouse, it's still drawing that circle, but every time it draws the circle, it also draws a square over the top of that. And so over time, or over times that it draws, really, so the amount of times that it draws, it slowly seems to disappear into the background. But it's really not disappearing. It's just being drawn over. You can kind of imagine it being like if you took like a kind of see-through sheet and you put a red dot down, and then you put a see-through sheet over it that's a little bit darker, and over time, yeah, that dot at the very bottom is gonna be like completely gone. Okay. So we did that. We did that. So what your assignment is for this one is to uh, make an object that follows the mouse and have it fade into the distance. Now we did just do that. Now what I want you to kind of try and challenge yourself to do is to change the shape, the color, and the transparency that we just wrote. Add comments similar to what we're doing, but you make sure that you go in and you change things. Once you finish that, make sure you put this into a zipped folder. If you forgot how to do that, go back and check out that specific lesson. I will make a specific how to put it in a zip folder just so you don't have to go and watch that over and over again. But for now, you can go back and you can check how do I put this in a zipped folder so that then I can submit it easily on whatever platform it is that you're turning this in on. For me, that's it, and I want to wish you some happy coding.